Welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine. We have a great event for you this evening with Jhumpa Lahiri talking about her new novel, Whereabouts. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the event, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. The chat function down there will not be active, but it will show, the column there will show you a link for purchasing copies of Whereabouts. It's a real honor to be introducing Jhumpa, who's had a charmed literary history and deservedly so. Her first published work, a collection of short stories, Interpreter of Maladies, appeared in 1999, won a Pulitzer, and quickly established Jhumpa, then in her early 30s, as a powerful contemporary voice of immigrants struggling to navigate between the cultural values of their homeland and their adopted home. Born in London to Bengali Indian immigrants and raised in Rhode Island after moving there at a young age, Jhumpa from the start showed an exceptional talent for capturing the perplexities of the immigrant experience and the search for identity. Several years after Interpreter of Maladies came Jhumpa's first novel, The Namesake, and then another collection of short stories, Unaccustomed Earth. Both won critical acclaim and sold well, furthering Jhumpa's reputation as a master portrayer of the details and nuances of immigrant life and cultural adjustment. Her next novel, The Lowland, set in Calcutta and Rhode Island, told the saga of Indian immigrants and was a finalist for the National Book Award. And her memoir, In Other Words, published 5 years ago, centered around her love affair with the Italian language. Whereabouts was written in Italian and translated into English by Jhumpa herself. Consisting of 46 short, fleeting chapters, the book tells the story of an unnamed woman living alone in an unnamed Italian city, at midlife, examining her situation, reflecting on her isolation. Reviewers have raved about the novel's elegance, poignancy, lyricism, profound interiority, and spare beauty. So definitely put Whereabouts on your reading list. Jhumpa will be in conversation this evening with Anna de Fina, professor of Italian language and linguistics at Georgetown University. Her interests and publications have focused on narrative, discourse and identity, immigrant and transnational communities, and diversity and superdiversity. She's written many articles and authored or edited a number of books, the latest being the Cambridge Handbook of Discourse Studies. So Jhumpa and Anna, take it away.
Jhumpa, do you want to start reading a passage of your book?
Sure, with pleasure, Anna. But before I do, I just want to thank everybody for being here, for being there, out there. Thank you, Brad, for your warm words of welcome. I love this bookstore so much, and I'm frustrated that I'm not inside of it right now physically. I've been there many times to talk and to listen, and I've always been struck by the readers who go to Politics and Prose and buy books there. It's such an incredible community and energy, and I do miss feeling that right now, but we'll pretend. But I'm very grateful, and I'm grateful for the bookstore for all that it's done to host me and so many other writers that I love. I'm going to read a brief section. They're all brief. This is particularly brief, just 2 pages, and it's called In the Sun. Today there are protests downtown, and the helicopters have been circling the city all morning. But it's the sun that wakes me up, and it beckons me to my desk, where I write, wrapped in my robe, and then it draws me down to the piazza, where I'm greeted by the contained mayhem of my neighborhood. It's a splendid Saturday, the first warm day. Only a few people are still wearing boots. I see jackets unzipped and the blistered heels of girls in flip-flops who can't stand the punishing leather ballerina flats anymore. Even though it's Saturday, there's still a dash of elegance to how people are dressed. The bold shade of a jacket, a bright scarf, the tight lines of a dress. It feels like a party effortlessly organized at the last minute. The piazza becomes a beach on days like this, and a sense of well-being, of euphoria, permeates the air. All the stores are full of people, long lines at the bank machine, the butcher, the bakery, but no one's complaining. If anything, they enjoy the wait. While I'm in line for a sandwich, a woman says, "What a spectacular day." And the man behind her says, "This neighborhood is always spectacular." It's my turn for the sandwich. "Just wait and see how delicious this one's going to be," the man behind the counter says. He's known me forever and makes me the same sandwich at least 3 times a week. Today, it's going to be the best ever. He dips a ladle into a bucket on the counter. He weighs 2 slices of fresh cheese on the scale, arranges them on a roll, wraps the sandwich in paper, and gives me the bill. "Here you go, my dear." It hardly costs anything. I look for a place to sit and find a spot in the playground where they deal drugs at night. But at this time of day, it's bursting with kids, parents, dogs, also a few people on their own like me. But today, I don't feel even slightly alone. I hear the babble of people as they chatter on and on. I'm amazed at our impulse to express ourselves, explain ourselves, tell stories to one another. The simple sandwich I always get amazes me too. As I eat it, as my body bakes in the sun that pours down on my neighborhood, each bite, feeling sacred, reminds me that I'm not forsaken.
So, should I start, Jhumpa?
Please.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, because as a reader, it's always a dream for somebody who loves literature to have the opportunity to ask questions to a favorite author. So I'm really thrilled at this opportunity. And then I just want to talk very briefly about my impression of the book in general, and then I'll go on to my questions. So I loved reading this book. It's a novel with a fascinating main character that deals with experiences that are universal, but also rooted in the particularities of this place, of this character, of these interactions. So I have enjoyed tremendously also the elegance of your writing, the simplicity of it, the fact that it's so essential and so direct and yet so rich and precise and so evocative of people and places. I don't think there's even a comma in excess in your book. So it's a novel that may appear simple, but it's everything but simple. I think it goes at the heart of a lot of human issues. For example, of course, loneliness, but also death, friendship, family, and exposes the ever-present conflicts between belonging and detachment, love and hate, guilt and joy. I think these themes, however, emerge through a minimalist lens, as you demonstrated with your reading, because we experience them through the everyday actions and encounters of a woman who goes about her life in a city. And we know very little about this woman. We don't even know her name. We know that she has a mother who lives in another city. Her father died prematurely. We know she has friends who invite her over. We know she likes to swim or to sit in front of the sea or to visit museums. But the details about who she is emerge little by little through her thoughts and her reactions to these everyday encounters, chores, and wanderings. So, as you demonstrated, this happening occupied the space of a few pages that constitute each of the chapters that make up whereabouts. So, one thing that I felt was really different in this book is that very little happens in terms of, classical action. So, in that sense, I'm not afraid to give out any spoilers. But while nothing happens in the technical sense, a lot happens inside the protagonist's mind. And in fact, significantly, you put there 3 chapters that are titled "In My Head." So in one of the reviews that I read on your book, you explained that the book is based on notes that you took over the years. And your protagonist's love for stationery shops and notebooks made me think of you actually going around with a very nice notebook and taking all these notes while visiting or while living there. So my first question is, can you talk a bit about the genesis of this book? At what point your notes became linked into the idea of a novel in your head? And can you comment on whether this process was any different from the process that you have gone through for other novels that have a more traditional development?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. It's so nice to see you. Can I just say I miss you, and I wish we were going out to dinner after this conversation. But thank you very much for reading the book and for talking with me about it. Well, this book was born in a notebook, like almost every book I've written has been born in a notebook of some form. And this one, I mean, normally they actually begin on a scrap of paper. You know, this book began as I was, I think it began maybe on some hotel note paper, because I first saw the character when I was on a train going from Rome to Venice. And I believe I was in the Venice hotel, and I was thinking about her. And I wrote down somewhere, the first flash of the character, and the first flash of the first episode, which is actually the last episode in the book. It's called On the Train, and the character is on a train. And so that was the first vision I had, if you will, of her. And then when I got back to Rome, I was living in Rome at the time. I did go to my stationery store. That's still there, by the way. It's not like in the book is invented, but I went to my stationery store, where now I'm very superstitious and I go for all the notebooks. And I bought a notebook, and I started to write down episodes about this woman, because I was very curious about her. And I saw her, but I didn't know her, right? Which is often how a character begins. You see a glimpse of them, you see them from the side, you see the back of their head, you see something catches your eye, but you don't know who they are. And I began to follow her in the notebook, and I put her in different settings. And so I started writing these episodes in the winter of 2015, when I was still living in Rome. And In Altre Parole had just been published, the book that became In Other Words in English. And so, you know, I was looking for something new, and I think emotionally something new to work on. And emotionally, I was already very apprehensive, because I knew that I would be leaving Rome at the end of the summer. I had made the decision to return to the United States to teach at Princeton University, and to start a new job, to go back to the United States, to leave Italy, where I was very happy, a place I didn't particularly want to leave, but in any case, I decided to leave. And I was very conflicted about this decision. And so it was in that frame of mind that the episodes started to accumulate in the notebook while I was still living in Rome. And they were in an order that I can't explain, because that notebook is actually in Rome. And what happened was, I brought the notebook back with me to the United States, and it just sat on one of these shelves. You see these shelves, not in this house. I was living in Brooklyn the first year, but it just sat on one of the, imagine a similar shelves in my study in my Brooklyn house. And it would just sit there doing nothing. And then when I was able to go back to Rome for the holidays, for the breaks, I would take the notebook with me. And I would open the notebook only there, and I would add episodes to this character's wanderings. She kept wandering, but she would only wander in the notebook, and she could only wander when I was in Rome. So that's how the book came to be. And but it's not very different from how most of my novels begin. I remember vividly taking notes on the backs of envelopes in strange places when ideas first come to me, because I think I'm always very afraid of actually writing. I'm always very afraid to write anything. And so the idea of putting something in a, I'm in here, so here I have a beautiful notebook, right? It's leather, it's gorgeous. I actually take notes in this notebook of a different kind, like notes when I go to lectures and notes, my reading notes, things like that. But when it comes to my own writing, they tend to emerge in the least, it's almost as if I'm so terrified of writing that I try to minimize the writing itself. So scraps of paper and this kind of thing, and then eventually when I run out of the scraps, when I realize I have to contain this note taking and put it into a notebook, then the note taking begins. But I could trace the genesis of every book I've written in a similar way. And now that I write in Italian, I have been writing exclusively by hand. So the whole notebook now exists in Rome somewhere in my cupboard in Rome. So the whole manuscript of Dove mi trovo, which is the original title of Whereabouts, is in this notebook, this green, large green notebook. With my other books, with the English books, at a certain point, I would transfer into a computer file. I would make the shift from the handwritten notes to the computer, and many of those books were largely composed on the computer. But now that I write in Italian, it's very hard for me to compose in Italian on the keyboard. I do it when I write more. If I write like an essay in Italian, it's okay, and I write it out by sometimes by computer. But even the other day, I had to write a brief essay in Italian about my new book of poems that's coming out next month in Italy. And in fact, I wrote it in this notebook, but it's different because it was an essay, but I did write it out by hand. Yeah.
So that's funny, because it's that kind of notebook that I imagine you using for writing this novel, for taking notes on this novel. But so let me start with another question. I felt that one of the big themes in this novel, and one that made me really interested in your protagonist, is the fact that she's possessed with opposite feelings all the time and urges. She constantly experiences them at times in very paralyzing way. For example, she often seems to want something and at the same time not want it. She longs for something, but she rejects it. For example, when she realizes that her ex-lover is calling her by mistake, she spends the whole day waiting for him to call her really. But then the minute he calls her, she tells him that she has a headache and she cannot. No? She wants to go to the countryside and forget about her routine. But after very little time that she's there, she has these feelings of anguish and fear. And then there is the sight of the decapitated mouse that really creates havoc in her mind. And then, I don't know, when she's leaving the apartment, she's going to rent it, she wants to make it perfect for the person who's going to rent it. But then she's completely unsettled by the idea of this person, stranger, occupying her space. So I think probably, but then you can tell me, these contrasting feelings are maybe a way to give us a sense of the confusion and turmoil that this character is going through. But then yesterday I was reading a novel by Paul Auster, and he makes one of the protagonists say that people are but a collection of contradictory selves. What do you think about that? Is your protagonist paralyzed by her personal crisis, or are we all, to a certain extent, continuously fighting contradictory feelings?
I very much think the latter. I think we are full of contradiction. I think life is full of contradiction. I think our souls, our psyche, our everything, our desires are always, I mean, that's the friction, that's the tension, that's the drama of life, right? And I think if there is drama in this novel, it is that interior drama of as you say, this push-pull toward the world, away from the world, to the outside, cowering from the outside toward people, away from people. But I think that's what we are made of, right? And I think that's really, I think we when we really begin to understand people, when we really begin to understand ourselves, we have to face the deep contradictions that are inside of us, and in some sense, embrace them, and to realize that we are more than one person, right? We're not, we're more than even two people. We're actually several people. Identity is a very fragmented thing. Identity is a kind of a mosaic, if you will. Mm-hmm. And the book is really exploring that I think on a lot of levels. I can say in retrospect, now that I've had some time to digest the book, but I think the whole sort of tension of the book is this, she's very much, on the threshold, sulla soglia, literally between inside and outside, between sort of this hesitancy of what to do with her life, where to go, how to be, whether to act on certain impulses or not. And, but I think, isn't that so common to so many of us? I feel that way various times throughout the day, in little ways, in petty ways, and should I have an apple now or not? I mean, but these are questions that have been asked by writers in the past, right? And I think contradiction is such a great theme of literature from the beginning. The other day I was talking to my friend and colleague Alessandro Giammei, who teaches at Bryn Mawr. He used to be here at Princeton, and he was talking about, I was talking to him about this book, and he brought up the example of Petrarch as is Petrarch somewhere in the back of your mind? And he wasn't in the back of my mind as I was writing, at least not consciously. But if you think of a writer, if you think of Petrarch's poetry, and the deep contrasts that characterize his language, right? And then Shakespeare picks up on that, and so many, that becomes part of the fabric of so much poetry. And so I think that in that sense, if there's an image, if there's a central image for this book, it is someone, really just like going like this all the time, sort of not sure of her equilibrium, right? Searching for it, but never quite sure which side, and how to find that equilibrium.
Yeah, and I think you do it. It's true. It's a theme of literature, but you do it in such a way that it takes courage to recognize that, that we have such duality, And this character illustrates it in an incredible way with all these, waverings that she has and opposite tendencies. Sometimes she loves somebody and then she's so hard on them. And again, I think you show it very beautifully. One thing I wanted to ask you also was the role of the city in this book. The protagonist at a certain point says something about that it doesn't matter where we are. No, she says something when all is said and done, the setting doesn't matter, because she's always feeling that she's never staying, that she's always passing from one space to the other. And yet she's also very rooted in this city. She knows the barista, she talks to him, she loves the family in the cartoleria, she goes to the museums. I mean, she is completely integrated in the city. And you also give a sense of life in that city. And I have two curiosities. One is, what role do you see for this city as a frame in this novel? But also, do you think that a solitude lived in a city like this can be different from a solitude lived in a different kind of city? I thought a lot about that.
That's a lovely question and a lovely thing to think about. I mean, I think for her, I think one of the things the book, I hope, shows is her relationship with the city, right? And I thought of it eventually when the book started to have a kind of, when these episodes started to come into a sort of a focus, a structure, if you will. I thought about sort of the portrait of a woman who was on her own in an urban setting. I thought about how the city can become a companion, and also in some sense, something that she feels that she can't fully penetrate and can't fully inhabit. So it's both, right? So it's the alienation and the participation, which is also, I think, a very universal feeling for so many of us, that we feel part of things, we feel part of places, and then there are moments when we feel differently and we feel that we're not actually fully inside of it. And so I thought about that, and I thought about, I mean, the book is set in an unnamed city, but as I said, the book was born in Rome, and from my impressions and my experience of the city. And I will say that Rome is the first city, the only city I've ever lived in, in which I never feel a kind of loneliness that I feel in other places. Not that I don't feel alone, and I've actually spent a lot of time alone in Rome. Not a lot, but enough to have a sense of inhabiting the city on my own. And it's a place where solitude is declined very differently. And I think that, I mean, I come from parents who came from Calcutta, right? Which was another city in which the fact of solitude is it has yet another iteration, because of course we all feel alone, no matter where we live. At one point or another, we all do feel alone, and we must feel alone, and we must create a relationship with our solitude. And I think that's what this protagonist is doing in the course of the book, is that she is building and she's meditating on, and in the course of these meditations, building her, or solidifying in some sense, her relationship with her solitude. Not that it's an easy relationship, not that it's because I think we have this tendency to kind of flatten things out and make things very, comfortable somehow. We have to make it work. We have to make it positive. We have to make it good. But life isn't like that. It's never like that. And so I think she does have a very complex relationship with her solitude, but I think it's a real relationship. And I think, sometimes the solitude gives her, the protective shade, right, that she seeks. And sometimes the solitude is too much for her, too much shade, and she craves other elements, people, sunlight, and so forth. So I do think that I think that the it's a nameless city, but of course in my head there's a Roman energy, right, that for me, from the writer's point of view, though I'm very conscious to not name the city, I chose not to put a name on this city, because I think that, I think names are very limiting, and especially for a city like Rome, which is itself a complete mosaic of meaning and time and experience, in such a powerful way. And one person's Rome is not the next person's Rome, and it's not the third person's Rome, right? And I think that's the beauty of the great cities of the world, right? Because they're so deeply complex, so deeply layered.
Yeah.
And contradictory, contradictory, right?
Again,
so, and I think that idea of contradiction, I mean, again, it goes back to, it sort of predates Rome in some sense, because the first great city I knew in my life was Calcutta. I grew up in the United States. I grew up in a very small town in the United States, and I visited cities, I suppose, as a child. I was taken to Washington. Went to Boston. I was taken to New York City. But the first city, the only city that made a profound impact, was Calcutta, and then eventually London. That was the other city of my childhood that I got to know and have a sense of. And those are two very different cities, but very large, very complex, and very layered cities, right? So I already had that sense. And what is Calcutta if not the deepest form of contradiction, right? And I think that, I think certainly for me, growing up in the United States in the 1970s, it was very interesting to tell people, tell my classmates, for example, but tell my teachers even, oh, well, I'm not going to be in school for the next 2 months. Why? Because I'm going to Calcutta. And I would see them just, very disturbed, because they had a notion of what that meant. They had a notion of Calcutta, and meanwhile, I was thinking, or the child in me was thinking, this is the city my parents love more than any other place on earth. This is a beautiful city. This is a rich, dynamic city full of extraordinary people, full of literature and music and beauty, and yes, other very problematic elements as well, right?
Yeah.
But that idea of contradiction, I think anybody, I mean, India as well, it's the idea of contradiction is so profound in a place like India. It's so profound, and you cannot escape it, and you must open yourself up to it, right? So yeah. So I think this novel, in some sense, is exploring perhaps even deeper. There's a deeper excavation going on in terms of thinking about ideas of urban reality and contradiction, and what that conjures in a person.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I want, because the time is going so fast, I want to jump now to a question some questions that are super interesting to me about translation. Because, okay, first I read your novel in English, and then I thought, okay, let me read it in Italian. And at the beginning, my reaction was how cool that she can self-translate, because I know from experience, having translated here and there stuff, that I stressed about, individual words for literally for hours. And I thought, oh, how cool, like you can say things like, in Italian, you say that at a certain point that she buys un coso per ospitare le spugne bagnate, no? Which you translate with the very much more technical word, the receptacle, in which my sponges can rest. And then in Italian, you say cucchiaioni di legno, but in English, you don't say cucchiaioni, you don't say big spoons, of course. And then at a certain point, when she's talking to the barista, and he's asking her about, the city, and she says she's always lived there. Then the barista says in Italian, questa città è una pantofola, which means literally this is a slipper. This city is a slipper. But you translate, this city is a big fat drag. So I was thinking, and then the last thing I noticed thousands of things, but one thing I noticed is that in Italian, you say when the protagonist goes to her mother, she gives her a vassoio di dolci, no? But then in English, you specify that these cakes, these cookies were wrapped up on a gilt-colored cardboard tray. So I thought, maybe because a vassoio in Italy, everybody knows what a vassoio of cookies looks like. But here it doesn't. So I've thought of the whole thing, how cool and liberating. And then I read your essay, where I find myself on self-translation, where you talk about the responsibility, the tremendous responsibility that you felt. You compared it to a surgeon doing surgery. And so I wanted to ask you about that a little bit. How do you see this process? Because I know that then you also say a lot of other stuff about translation, but I wanted just to open up this conversation because I think it's so interesting that you self-translated. How was this process for you?
Well, I also had deep anxiety about every single word, basically. So, in that sense, there's no avoiding the anxiety, because it is a very grave act and responsibility. It's an enormous responsibility. But the thing about, our dear mutual friend Domenico Starnone, whose works I've translated. Yeah. And the responsibility I feel when I translate Domenico, or when I translate other authors, when I translate even the brief excerpts in Whereabouts by other, there are 2 citations in the book, one by Italo Svevo and one a brief passage by Alvaro. And those are the passages I feel truly responsible for, because they are not my words. They are words written by somebody else, composed by somebody else. And I feel so responsible and still uneasy, because I worry, I know if I went back to the translation today, right now, and put the Italian and the English side by side, I would think, oh, maybe not, maybe I should have done it like this, because translation is translating literature. There is no hard and fast right answer, right? Because literature is inherently so complex, right? So it opens up that complexity and reinforces the complexity and the ambiguity. In terms of translating myself, the kind of weird thing was that feeling responsible for oneself is a very strange concept, right? Or even this word that we use, that people use in translation, which is not always very helpful, but the idea of being faithful to the text. Well, what does that even mean when it's your own text? And do I have the right as the author of the text to also completely, sort of reshape and reconfigure things and not feel bad about, I teach translation here to students at Princeton, and sometimes, I have to really explain that, we have to step away from this idea of being quote unquote literal, because there is no literal translation. There is no literal translation that feels normal and natural. It just feels like translation. And translation is not, real translation isn't, it has to become literature. I mean, if you're translating literature, you have to make literature again. And so you have to take you have to make decisions, right? Like the city is a slipper doesn't mean anything in English.
Right.
It has no meaning, right? So I have to think of a creative solution. And so I think, okay, this la città è una panto. You have to think of like, what is the state of mind of when this person is, when the barista is saying that? What is he really trying to convey? And so I came up with, a big fat drag, right? So it requires creativity, it requires imagination, it requires accepting that languages don't just, meet up like this, and that it's really like, you have to create, you have to recreate the text. And so it was very illuminating for me to translate this book, and it taught me a lot about writing, about my own writing. It taught me a lot about translation. It taught me about sort of what it means to translate myself versus translating other authors. It gave me a clearer sense of the whole panorama of activity that is now, of interest to me.
Yeah, and maybe this will be my last question for the moment, because I know that the audience is eager to ask questions too. But I think on this issue of translation, there was something you said that really resonated with me. You said, I think of any definitive text largely the same way that I think of a mother tongue, at least in my case, an inherently debatable, perpetually relative concept. So to me, this resonates a lot, because I think that for people who live in between different languages, the concept of a mother tongue is something completely relative, in the sense that your mother tongue sometimes is not even your favorite language. Sometimes you have to use another language in certain, or you feel like using another language in certain situations. You wonder whether you ever get to consider one of your languages as your mother tongue, or rather you have different languages at your disposal and for different things, and sometimes they enrage you and sometimes you love them, and it depends on so many things. So I think this is really difficult for some people to understand, but to me it was very clear that this idea of the mother tongue is very skewed towards people who only have one language. What do you think of
it? It is, right? And I think, I mean, and it's a container, right? It's a container, but it doesn't contain everybody, right? So, for example, when I first started writing in Italian, people would say, "Oh, well, isn't this interesting? Because, your mother tongue is Bengali." But not everybody said that. If there were 10 people in the room, 5 people would say my mother tongue was Bengali, and the other 5 people would say, "Oh, this is interesting because your mother tongue is English."
Right.
So then I would say to this group of 10 people, how can how can this be, right? In fact, and in exploring these questions, gave rise to the book that became In Other Words. And in that book, I look at this question and I kind of tease out the meaning or the significance of this question. And then I try to kind of conceive of what did actually happen, which is, yes, Bengali was literally, the language of my mother and father, and the first language I spoke. And then, I began to form a relationship with English as well, English, who kind of, subentra. I don't know how you how do you say that in English actually, but enters in in a second phase as a stepmother. But even there, the metaphor doesn't completely hold, because normally, you know, I mean, it's not that the mother died, right? She was also there. So it's more like, you know, I guess a stepmother because the parents get a divorce, you know, and then the father remarries. So then you have these two maternal figures. So I suppose it was something along those lines. In any case, it was complicated. And so many people's relationship to language is similarly complicated but for very different reasons. But I definitely think that people who are raised, as you say, between languages, especially people who are raised in countries where their parents are rooted in another language, a language that is not commonly spoken in the place where you're living, feel this. They feel this, you know, the inability to be in the container of the quote unquote mother tongue, which I view with great suspicion, because it doesn't apply to me, you know. It doesn't apply to my husband either. He was also raised amongst languages, you know. He was raised in Latin America. His parents spoke perfect English and perfect Spanish. There were two languages going on in the house. My father-in-law spoke Greek because his parents were Greek. So, I mean, how do you put a mother? How do you have mother tongue when you have an experience like that? You can have many languages that you move in and out of, you know. But I mean, look at Borges, you know. I mean, he grew up in a very interesting household where there was English, where there was Spanish, and that is reflected in his development as a reader and as a writer, you know. So, but people get very, very insistent on this mother tongue topic or subject of mother tongue, because it's a direct kind of pipeline to the question of identity. And people just cling, you know, they cling to, you know, this idea of being something and having that identity, and not having a precise identity can be so threatening. Yeah. Can be so threatening, you know, can be sort of threatening on a sort of existential level. So anyway, but I think I've come to think of things very differently as I've gotten older.
Okay, well, now I'm going to look at some of the questions from the audience. Well, the first question I think you answered because it was about translation. The second question says, in other words, focused a lot on your journey of discovering a new language, making friends with it and getting comfortable with it. Where are you in your relationship with Italian as you worked on whereabouts?
So what kind of relationship as I worked on whereabouts? I think it was still, I mean, as I said, you know, I could only write the book when I was physically back in Italy. So it was a very particular creative moment in my life. When, you know, literally the book was, you know, I never opened the notebook when I was here. I needed to be back in Italy. I needed to be back in Rome. It was, you know, it was like a faucet, you know, and I would come to America, even if I wanted the Italian writing to come out, it wasn't. And but now, so I wrote Whereabouts now already some time ago, 2015, 16, 17, you know, I spent those years writing this book, maybe. And now it's 2021 and I'm in a different place with Italian. And I was struck that over the pandemic time that most of which I spent in the United States, in Princeton, I had no choice. I wasn't able to go back to Italy for most of the pandemic. And I did write, I did work on and finish a new book in Italian here in the United States. Now, again, the soil had already been prepared for that book, and the stories in that book, everything had already been conceived and envisioned and worked. I think things had been, I had already sown the seeds and all of that in Italy, and so again, the book is very much rooted, the composition of the book is very much rooted in Italy, but I was still able to cultivate the language here. I was not able to do that with Whereabouts. I wrote the book in Italy. I kept going back to Italy to work on it. I went back to Italy to show it to people, to share it with people. And then at a very late stage, I did share it with some readers, Italian readers who were also here. But that was in a much later phase, because I still felt that, I had to be there because because my relationship with the language necessitated that I was there. I would never have heard what the barista said about Rome being the city being a slipper here. You don't hear those things here. So that's the thing about being in the place and being, moving through the language and just absorbing in the course of your day-to-day activities. It's a very different experience.
Well, I have more questions on translation and language, but maybe let's at least answer a question on the novel again. So Sandy Price, she asks, I was captivated by your description of the room in the museum, to which the protagonist felt a special personal connection. Is that patterned after an actual museum?
It is. It's the museum in which the room of Livia is housed in Rome. And that's the room that I describe in that chapter.
Okay, and then, okay, another question. It says, after such, Atsuko Origuchi, after such a sense of profound love and affinity for the Italian language and for Rome, which part of your identity called you back stateside? Can you please speak to how your Indian American and Italian identities inform your writing now? Your previous work straddled the first two, but your latest seems entirely seeped into your Italian experience.
So there were two parts of the question. So it remind me, the first part
first part was what called you back to?
Oh, right. So what called me back was a job, was the opportunity to teach at Princeton, to teach literature and writing and translation at Princeton University, and I accepted it. I accepted this offer because I wanted to have the freedom to write in Italian. And so I knew that by writing in Italian, I was taking a big leap, a big chance. It was a big risk for me, and that maybe people wouldn't be particularly interested in what I was doing. And so I thought it was better for me to have more security for my family and for myself. And so I took the job, and it's given me a lot of things, more, not just financial security. It's been a very stimulating experience to be a professor, to engage with students, to think about literature in the classroom setting, thinking about passing down my love of books, of authors, and many things have come out of my time here. But that's what drew me back. I made this kind of compromise because I knew that you know, if I had stayed in Rome and wanted to keep writing in Italian, that would have become that would not have been tenable. And I had to be very practical at the same time about how to live and how to raise my children and so on. So that's what brought me back here.
And then another question. Okay, so Ellen Bomazang, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce properly. The protagonist's personal situation seems vastly different from yours, but how much of her is you, or do you not see yourself in her at all?
Again, I think it's never black and white like that. You know, I think I see myself in every character I've ever written. There's something of me in every character I've ever written, really. Almost every major character I've written, there's something of me there, and they're pieces of me, they're pieces of others. Creating characters is always often it's composite. It's created from layers and different aspects of people, you know, people you imagine, people you might have glimpsed one day walking down the street, you know. That's how, at least that's how I work as a writer, you know. And so, you know, yes, this character is very different from me and her biography, you know, her experiences in some sense are the opposite of my experiences, you know. She's someone who's very rooted to her place. She's apprehensive about leaving that place. She's unmarried. She doesn't have children. You know, so the most significant experiences of my life, in some sense, she doesn't share. She doesn't know about. At the same time, I think, you know, I feel very close to her and can imagine many of the things she does and many of the things she feels, you know. But I think being a writer is about being able to step into other people's hearts and imaginations and consciousness. And I think that's what's always really interested me about writing, is that ability to step in and out of myself and, you know, carry over little bits of myself that are necessary to give life to an invented character on the page, right?
We have time maybe for another question. Let me see. Megan Loftus, she asks, what motivated the choice to write this in episodes, as you stated earlier, as opposed to writing it as a novel with more of a narrative arc?
I don't know. This was how it was born, you know? I mean, art is very mysterious and I don't think about it very much, honestly. I'm so grateful when the inspiration comes and I just try to follow it. And then I evaluate at a later stage if it's going to, you know, if it's going to succeed or not, right? So this is how the book was born. It was born in these flashes, and it was born in the particular notebook it was born in, and it was very clear that it was going to have this kind of pacing, this kind of you know, these episodic you know, moments, and I'm always interested when stories come to me in a new way. I mean, you know, I don't like doing things the same way. I had written The Lowland, which was a totally different novel, very different sensibility, different architecture altogether. And so I was interested in the fact that a story was coming to me in a very different way and a character was emerging in a very different way. I'm always drawn to the new and to the unexplored. I had never written a book like this before. So I was curious to see what that would be like. And I just followed the inspiration, and it's only at the end or toward the end that maybe you show it with 2 or 3 people and they say, well, this is actually, I think this is working. Or sometimes they say, no, I don't think this is working. Maybe you need to go back and put in a lot of plot and stuff, but I didn't hear that from my readers. I think the readers who read it understood it and understood the spirit of the book, which is really much closer to poetry than, a novel like The Lowland, certainly. And that's, the book for me is so much about language and the words and the choices of the words. And that was my focus in writing the book. And I think that's what is the heart of the book is the language, right? Even now that it's in English, it's still the words, I think, and the sentences that are really at the center.
Thank you so much, Jhumpa. I think we've come to the top of the hour, right, Bradley? So I'll let you finish, but thank you.
Great moderating, Anna. And Jhumpa, I was thinking with Anna, we could have done this talk in Italian, with English subtitles.
Subtitles.
Yeah, maybe next time. I did really love what you said, Jhumpa, about the art of translating. That translating literature means creating literature again. That says a lot. And your book captures so well the internal conflicts that so many of us wrestle with. But one thing that people shouldn't be conflicted about is whether to buy and read your book. They must, and that's all the more clear from this evening's discussion. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing Whereabouts. And P&P's Director of Events, Brittany Kerfoot, will be teaching a class on Jhumpa's fiction, including this book. So please check that out. There's a link to the class in the chat column here, and also a link on P&P's website. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to